The lights were dim in the plush lobby, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. As the black CEO stepped out of the elevator, he adjusted his suit, feeling every inch of his hard-earned success. Yet, what was supposed to be a routine meeting turned into something far darker. The moment he stepped into the building, a uniformed officer made a crude joke about his appearance, laughing with his colleagues as if the CEO's presence was an affront to their privilege. The CEO's smile faltered, but he swallowed the bitter sting of the insult. Ignore it, he thought. But as he approached the receptionist, the police officer's laughter followed him, their jeers echoing through the marble floors. It was just a taste of the bigotry that had poisoned the world he'd worked so hard to dominate. But today, something in him snapped. He wasn't about to let this go. He wasn't going to walk away this time. The CEO stood tall, but the weight of the moment was suffocating. He had known for a long time that this world wasn't meant for him. His success was a mark of defiance in a system designed to keep people like him down. But he was here now, in the heart of it all, and he had a decision to make. Stay quiet, or make them listen, he wondered. He wasn't sure what the answer was, but what he did know was that he would not leave here without changing something. He walked to the front desk, his mind racing. "I'm here for my meeting," he said, his voice calm, but a storm was brewing underneath. The officer who had mocked him earlier was now smirking, watching him closely as if he were some kind of specimen. But the CEO's eyes locked with his, and something shifted. The officer could feel it, the raw power that emanated from the CEO. It was a threat, though unspoken. That smirk began to falter, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The system wasn't supposed to be questioned, especially not by someone like him. The CEO turned his back, but not without a final glance over his shoulder. "They will see me. They will hear me," he muttered under his breath. The next few hours would determine whether his voice would rise above the smirks and the laughter, whether he would leave the building just another black man who tried and failed, or whether he would reshape the narrative of power in ways no one could anticipate. The lights were dim in the plush lobby, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. As the black CEO stepped out of the elevator, he adjusted his suit, feeling the weight of his hard-earned success. However, what should have been a routine business meeting quickly turned into something much darker. The moment he entered, a uniformed officer made a crude joke about his appearance, laughing with his colleagues as if the CEO's very presence was an insult to their privilege. The CEO's smile faltered, but he swallowed the bitterness of the remark. Ignore it, he thought. But as he approached the receptionist, the officer's laughter echoed behind him, bouncing off the sleek marble floors. It was a small moment, yet it encapsulated everything about the world he fought against, the world that sought to keep him, and others like him, in their place. But today, something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let this pass. He wasn't going to walk away like so many times before. The CEO stood tall, but the weight of the moment was suffocating. He had known for years that this world wasn't designed for him. His success was an act of defiance in a system built on exclusion and oppression. But today, he wasn't going to let that system control him. Stay silent, or make them listen? The question burned in his mind, but he already knew what he had to do. He approached the front desk, his voice calm but the tension palpable. "I'm here for my meeting," he said. The officer who had mocked him earlier stood there, smirking, clearly sizing him up. But the CEO's gaze didn't waver. He locked eyes with the officer, and for a split second, something shifted. The officer's smug expression faltered, replaced by uncertainty. The CEO felt a surge of power, a quiet, undeniable force. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The system wasn't meant to be challenged, not by someone like him. But the CEO didn't flinch. He turned away from the desk, but not without one final look over his shoulder. "They will see me. They will hear me," he murmured to himself. What would happen in the next few hours would decide whether his voice could rise above the laughter, whether he would walk away as just another black man who tried and failed, or whether he would change the very rules of the game. The tension in the air was palpable as the CEO made his way deeper into the building. Every step echoed in the silence, but the laughter from the officers seemed to follow him, a constant reminder of the world that had never quite accepted him. He had built his empire from the ground up, fought for every opportunity, but it was moments like this that reminded him just how far society still had to go. The front desk receptionist looked up at him with an expression that was hard to read, but he could feel the silent judgment in her eyes. She didn't say a word, but her gaze lingered just long enough to make him uncomfortable. He had dealt with this before, the subtle discrimination, the little things that chipped away at a person's spirit without ever showing their true face. But today, he wasn't going to let it slide. Today was different. "I'm here for my meeting," he said again, his voice firm, a slight edge creeping in as he stared down the receptionist. She didn't flinch. She merely gestured toward the elevators, a polite but dismissive motion that barely acknowledged his presence. He could feel the sting of that dismissal, but he swallowed it down, knowing there was no time to waste on the small things. As he entered the elevator, he could hear the murmur of voices behind him. The officers were still talking, still laughing, still making crude remarks. But this time, he didn't turn around. He pressed the button for the top floor and waited for the doors to close, his reflection staring back at him in the polished elevator mirror. The man in the reflection looked calm, composed, the embodiment of the success he had fought so hard for. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. As the elevator rose, so did the pressure. He was getting closer to the meeting, but he could already feel the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. The higher he went, the more the reality of the situation hit him. He wasn't just fighting for a business deal. He was fighting for something much bigger. He was fighting to be seen, to be heard, to prove that he belonged in a world that was determined to keep him out. The elevator dinged as it reached the top floor, and the doors slid open. The stark contrast between the modern, sleek interior of the office and the dark reality outside hit him in the chest. He stepped out into the lobby, his eyes scanning the room. It was everything he had worked for: glass walls, high-end furniture, and an aura of wealth that practically radiated from every corner. But it didn't feel like home. He had built this empire, but the emptiness of it all settled into the pit of his stomach. This wasn't the first time he'd felt this way. There had been moments before, when he realized that no matter how much success he achieved, there would always be people who would look at him and see nothing but the color of his skin. And in that moment, he was reminded of something his father had always told him: the higher you climb, the more they will try to bring you down. He took a deep breath and adjusted his suit before walking toward the conference room. This was it. The moment he had worked for. He wasn't just here to close a deal. He was here to make a statement. As he walked past the other executives, he could feel their eyes on him, the judgment, the doubt, the silent whispers. But he held his head high. This was his time. He had earned it. He reached the conference room door, paused, and then pushed it open. The room went silent as he entered. All eyes were on him. It was always the same. He had gotten used to it, but it never felt normal. He had learned to ignore the stares, the hushed conversations, the way people looked at him like he was somehow out of place. He wasn't supposed to be here. But he was. He had earned his seat at the table. He belonged. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, and the meeting began. The meeting room was sterile, immaculate, a reflection of everything he had worked for, and yet, as he stepped inside, it felt more like a trap than a triumph. The executives were already seated, their eyes flicking up at him, their faces impassive but their judgments palpable. He could sense it before anyone spoke: his presence here wasn't accepted, it wasn't normal. He had seen this look before. The way people could look at him and see only his skin, and not the man who had fought for every inch of this moment. The voices in his head began to swirl again, echoing his father's words: the higher you climb, the more they will try to bring you down. He felt it now. This was the moment when they would try to make him feel small, to remind him that no matter how much he had achieved, the world would never see him as equal. But he had learned long ago that this battle wasn't just about closing deals. It was about survival. It was about proving that he belonged here, no matter what. He stood tall, his back straight, and walked to the head of the table with the kind of grace that came from years of practice. The room went silent. For a brief second, no one said anything, and in that silence, he could hear the weight of their stares. He took his seat at the table, the chair cold beneath him, but the discomfort was familiar. He placed his hands on the surface, fingers splayed out in a show of control, though inside, his nerves were electric. The first executive spoke, his voice sharp, cutting through the stillness of the room. "I hope you understand the importance of this meeting," the man said, his eyes briefly flicking over the CEO. "The numbers need to reflect our growth, not just ambition." The words stung, not because they were a surprise, he had heard them 100 times before, but because of the tone, the subtle insinuation that his success was somehow less valid, less earned than theirs. The other executives shifted slightly, waiting for the black CEO to respond. They all knew what was at stake here. A multi-million-dollar deal that could change the trajectory of the company. A deal that, if done right, would cement his position in this world. But they also knew that for a man like him, it wouldn't just be about business. It was about the message. His success represented a challenge to everything they had ever known. And they weren't sure they were ready for that. "I understand," the CEO replied, his voice steady, but every word was laced with intent. "And I understand the responsibility that comes with it. But let me be clear, I am not here to be accepted. I am here to succeed." There was a moment of stunned silence before one of the other executives cleared his throat. "Of course," the man said, his tone now guarded. "But do you really think you're ready for the level of scrutiny that comes with this?" The question hung in the air, charged with the weight of everything that had happened before. The CEO met the man's gaze without hesitation, the words coming from him as if they were long rehearsed, though they felt raw, real. "I've been scrutinized my whole life," he said, his voice low but firm. This is just another challenge." The silence in the room thickened. It was a silence that spoke louder than words. It was the silence of doubt, of uncertainty, of people who had never truly believed that someone like him could rise to this level. But the CEO wasn't here to play the game by their rules. He wasn't here to beg for respect. He was here to demand it. He wasn't just fighting for the deal, he was fighting for the recognition that had always been denied him. He sat back in his chair, his eyes scanning the faces around him. They were all waiting for him to falter, for him to show weakness, for him to back down. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Not today. Not ever. The silence lingered in the room, thick with tension. The CEO could feel the eyes of every executive on him, their judgment, their disbelief palpable in the air. It was as if they were waiting for him to crack, to show a moment of weakness that would validate their doubts about him, but he refused to give them that satisfaction. His voice had already cut through the silence, unwavering, and now, it was time to prove that he belonged here. "If you're going to question my readiness, then let me make one thing clear," the CEO said, his gaze moving from one executive to the next, each face now hardening with the realization that this wasn't just another meeting, this was a battle for respect, for acknowledgement. "I am more than ready. This deal is just as much about proving myself as it is about your numbers. But more than that, it's about showing the world that people like me, people who have had to fight for every inch of ground, can not only survive in this world but can dominate it. That is what you're looking at right now. Not just a CEO, but someone who understands what it means to make it against all odds." The room was quiet for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to argue. The man who had spoken first, the one who had subtly questioned his capabilities, now shifted in his seat. His face had tightened, a flicker of something, perhaps respect, perhaps grudging acknowledgement, flashing across his features, but he quickly masked it with a stiff smile. "We understand the stakes," he replied, though the edge in his voice now seemed more reserved. "But can you really handle the pressure of the spotlight? You've already made a name for yourself, but this is on a different level. You're not just leading a company now, you're leading a movement." The word stung, more than he would have liked to admit. Leading a movement? He didn't want to be a symbol. He didn't want to be the face of some kind of societal revolution. He wanted to be respected for his abilities, for his accomplishments, for the work he had put in, just like any other CEO in the room. But the weight of the reality hung heavily on him. His success was never just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or held back. His success was theirs, too. He had become more than a man in a suit, he had become a beacon of possibility. "I'm not here to lead a movement," the CEO said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm here to prove that I am just as capable as any of you, and that my success is not some anomaly. It's a product of hard work, of resilience, of the same drive that got all of you where you are today." The silence in the room deepened again, the executives exchanging glances, their thoughts clearly conflicted. No one had expected him to speak like this, to stand his ground so fiercely. For a moment, it was as if they were seeing him for the first time, not just as a black man who had fought his way into their world, but as someone who was just as determined, just as capable, as anyone else in the room. Finally, one of the younger executives spoke, his voice quieter than the others but filled with a quiet curiosity. "And if we fail?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge in itself. "If this deal doesn't go through? What happens then?" The CEO met his gaze, a slight smile forming at the corner of his mouth. "Failure is not an option," he said, his tone final, his resolve unshakable. "But if it does happen, we learn from it. We adapt. We grow. And we come back stronger." The room fell into an uneasy stillness, and the CEO could feel the change in the air. It was subtle, but it was there. The question was no longer whether he belonged, the question was now whether they could keep up with him. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time in the meeting, the CEO could see doubt in their eyes, not about his ability to lead, but about whether they had underestimated him all along. The room was still, the weight of the silence pressing in from every corner as the CEO looked around at the faces of the executives. For a moment, it felt as though the air had thickened, heavy with something more than just tension. It was the realization that the game had changed. He had been underestimated, written off by so many, but now, as he stood here, he could see the flickers of doubt in their eyes. They hadn't expected him to push back like this. They hadn't expected him to be this unyielding. The CEO sat up straighter, his hands now resting firmly on the table. He had always known that his success would never be a smooth ride. He had fought tooth and nail for every opportunity, every deal, every inch of respect he had earned. But this moment, right here, was different. It wasn't just about business. It was about dignity. It was about proving that a black man could not only survive but thrive in a world that had been built to exclude him. "Let me be clear," the CEO continued, his voice calm but firm. "I am not here to play by anyone's rules but my own. I have worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to be treated as an afterthought. This deal is mine, and I will do whatever it takes to make it happen." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything he had fought for. He could see the executives shift in their seats, the discomfort spreading among them. They were no longer questioning his readiness, they were questioning their own assumptions about him. It was clear now, this wasn't just a man trying to prove himself, this was a force to be reckoned with. One of the older executives, the one who had been the most vocal in his doubts earlier, cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You're a formidable man," he said, his voice grudging but respectful. "I'll give you that. But there's more at stake here than just pride. This company," he trailed off, his words hanging in the air as he realized that the CEO wasn't the only one who had something to prove. The stakes were higher now. For the first time in the meeting, the CEO could see that they were starting to understand the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just a business transaction, this was a battle for the very soul of their company. It was about who got to lead, who got to decide what success looked like. It was about power. "I'm not here for your validation," the CEO replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't need your approval to know my worth. I am here because I have earned my place, and I will not let anyone take that away from me." The room was quiet again, but this time, the silence was different. It was no longer oppressive or uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, reflective, as if the executives were beginning to see him in a new light, not just as the black man who had fought his way into their world, but as a man who had proven himself through hard work, resilience, and a relentless drive to succeed. The younger executive, the one who had asked if he was ready for the pressure earlier, now sat back in his chair, his posture shifting from defensive to more neutral. "I think we can all agree that we want what's best for this company," he said, his voice now more tentative, as though he was reconsidering his earlier position. The CEO nodded slowly, understanding that this was a critical moment. They were beginning to see him not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged in this world. It wasn't going to be easy, but he had made the first step. The battle was far from over, but the tides had shifted. He had planted the seed of doubt, and now, all he needed to do was nurture it. What I'm asking for, the CEO continued, his tone softer but no less determined, is the chance to prove myself. Not because I'm black. Not because I'm anything other than what I am, a capable leader. Give me the chance, and I will show you that my success here is not just possible, it's inevitable. The room was still again, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't a wall anymore, it was a door, slowly creaking open. The tension in the room hadn't completely lifted, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The door had been opened, and while they had not fully embraced it, the executives had begun to understand something they hadn't before. This was no longer about whether the CEO belonged here, it was about whether they were willing to accept that he did. The meeting continued, but the dynamic had changed. Every word the CEO spoke now carried a weight that the room could not ignore. His voice, once met with skepticism, was now listened to with a kind of reluctant respect. The older executive who had first questioned his readiness shifted uncomfortably in his chair, as though the enormity of what had just transpired was finally sinking in. The CEO knew this wasn't the end, this was only the beginning. He had taken the first step in breaking down the walls that had kept people like him out for so long, but the real work was just starting. The stakes had never been higher. As the conversation shifted back to the specifics of the deal, the CEO focused, dialing in on the numbers, the projections, the strategy. This was where he excelled, where the others had no choice but to acknowledge his expertise. He was more than capable, and he had the results to prove it. He felt the eyes of the room on him again, but this time, there was no judgment, no doubt. They were watching him because he was the best person for the job. For the first time in this meeting, he felt a strange sense of power, real power, the kind that came not from being given a seat at the table, but from earning it, from proving he belonged. One of the younger executives, the same one who had questioned him earlier, now leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You're not just here to close a deal, are you?" he asked, his voice quieter, more measured. "You're here to change something. You want to shift the way this company operates, the way we think." The CEO met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm here to lead," he said firmly, "to challenge everything that has kept us from being the best we can be. This company is capable of more. But that starts with understanding that leadership comes in all forms, and it's not about fitting a mold, it's about being effective, about bringing something new to the table. What I bring is experience, vision, and the ability to get things done." There was a pause, and the younger executive nodded slowly, as if he was starting to see the full picture. "And what about the pressure?" he asked. "You said you've been scrutinized your whole life. But this is different. This is corporate America, the spotlight is on you now." The CEO thought for a moment, feeling the weight of the question. "I've always been in the spotlight," he said quietly. "It's not new to me. But I've also learned that the spotlight doesn't define me. What defines me is my ability to push through, to succeed no matter what the world throws at me. This," he gestured around the room, "is just another challenge. It's not about being perfect. It's about making it happen, no matter the odds." The room fell silent again, but the silence felt different now. There was no longer an undercurrent of skepticism, there was respect. And for the first time, it felt like they were starting to see him for who he really was, not just a man who had fought his way to the top, but a man who had earned his place there. The older executive spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I think we can all agree that this company could use a little bit of what you're offering," he said, his words measured but genuine. "You've got our attention." The CEO nodded, his expression calm, but inside, he could feel the shift. It wasn't just about the deal anymore. It was about what came next, the recognition, the respect, the acknowledgement that he was not just a part of the system, but someone who could change it. He had taken the first step, but now, he needed to keep pushing, to keep proving that he belonged here, not because of what he looked like, but because of what he could do. And he was going to do it, no matter what. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, but it was still tense. The CEO could feel the change, the way the executives now looked at him not just with professional curiosity, but with an edge of wariness, as if they were trying to figure out just how far he was willing to push, how far they could go before he cracked. The words he had spoken earlier were still hanging in the air, their weight shifting the entire dynamic of the room. It was clear now that this was more than a simple business meeting. This was a test, not just of his skills, but of his resolve, his ability to navigate the complexities of a world that was still deeply divided by race and power. The younger executive, the one who had seemed the most skeptical at first, was now watching him more closely. His eyes were narrowed, like someone who had just caught a glimpse of something they hadn't seen before. "I think we need to talk about what happens next," the executive said, his voice more cautious now. "You've proven you can handle the pressure, but what about the long term?" The question was a fair one. The CEO had managed to navigate this one moment, but sustaining that success, maintaining that position of power in a system that was designed to resist him, would be the real challenge. It wasn't just about this deal. It was about staying at the table, making sure that he didn't just become a token, that he wasn't just the black CEO who managed to land a big deal, but the man who could shape the company's future. "The long term," the CEO repeated, his voice steady. "That's the easy part. The pressure? That's just the beginning. The real work comes when you realize that staying at the top means constantly proving yourself. It means navigating the waters of corporate politics, the subtle but ever-present biases, and making sure that no matter how they try to push you down, you stand up again, stronger than before." There was a brief silence, and the CEO could feel the weight of the conversation settling in. This wasn't just a business discussion anymore, it was about survival. It was about carving out space in a world that had been built by and for people who looked nothing like him. The older executive, the one who had been most dismissive in the beginning, now spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You're right. It's not just about this deal. It's about the future. About what kind of company we want to be, and whether we can be bold enough to change." The words were unexpected, but they were exactly what the CEO needed to hear. There was no apology in the man's tone, no acknowledgement of the biases that had shaped their perceptions of him, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that the conversation was shifting. The wall that had been built around him, around people like him, was starting to crack, just a little. And that crack was enough to plant a seed, enough to show the executives that they weren't just dealing with a black man in a suit, they were dealing with someone who had the power to change the system, to make it bend, just a little bit, to his will. The CEO took a deep breath, letting the moment settle in. "I'm not asking for charity," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm asking for the chance to prove that the future we're building is one where anyone can thrive. It doesn't matter where you come from, what you look like, or what your story is. What matters is what you bring to the table and how much you're willing to fight for what you deserve." The room fell into a heavy silence again, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't the silence of doubt, it was the silence of realization. The CEO knew that they were beginning to understand not just who he was, but what he represented. The deal, the company, the future, it was all intertwined now, and the power dynamic was shifting in ways that no one could have predicted. He wasn't just fighting for his place at the table anymore, he was fighting to change the game itself. The moment lingered, thick with the weight of what had just been said. The silence in the room was no longer oppressive, but contemplative. The executives sat back in their chairs, their faces unreadable, but the tension was palpable. They were thinking, processing, evaluating everything that had just unfolded. For the CEO, this was a defining moment. He had made his case, and now it was up to them to decide whether they were ready to change, ready to break free from the rigid systems they had built their empires on. The older executive, the one who had always questioned him, leaned forward in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he considered the CEO's words. "You've made a strong argument," he said slowly, his tone thoughtful, "and I think you've given us something to think about. But the reality is that change is hard. It's not just about what we want, it's about what we've built, and the system we've worked within for so long." The CEO could feel the undertone of resistance, the reluctance to truly shake things up. He knew it was coming. Change was always met with resistance, especially from those who had grown comfortable in their positions of power. But he had never been one to back down from a challenge. "I understand that," the CEO replied, his voice calm but firm. "Change is hard, but that's exactly why it's necessary. If we keep doing things the way we've always done them, we'll never move forward. We'll always be stuck in the past, repeating the same mistakes. What I'm offering isn't just a chance to make more money or land bigger deals, it's a chance to build something that lasts, something that's built on the principles of fairness, inclusion, and opportunity for everyone, not just the privileged few." The words hung in the air, and the room was quiet again. The CEO could see the wheels turning in the minds of the executives, but he knew that they were still hesitant, still unsure if they were ready to take that leap. It wasn't just about him proving himself anymore, it was about them proving to themselves that they could be a part of the change. "You're asking us to fundamentally change the way we operate," one of the younger executives spoke up, his voice still tinged with uncertainty. "It's not that we don't see the value in what you're saying, but the reality is, people like you, people who have had to fight for everything, are still seen as a risk. We don't want to lose everything we've built." The CEO took a deep breath, understanding where the fear was coming from. These executives had built their careers, their fortunes, by following the rules, by staying within the boundaries of the system. But that system had always been built to keep people like him out. It had kept people like him from the seats at the table, from the opportunities to prove themselves. "You think this is a risk," the CEO said quietly, but with fire in his voice. "But the real risk is staying in the same place, in the same outdated system. The world is changing, and if you don't adapt, you'll be left behind. You'll be the ones who miss out on the future because you were too afraid to take a chance." The words hit hard, and the room fell silent once more. For a moment, no one spoke, and the weight of the decision pressed in on all of them. The CEO knew that this was the crossroads. This was the moment that could either define his future or leave him just another man who had tried and failed. But he wasn't ready to give up, not now, not ever. He wasn't going to let them reduce him to a token. He was more than that. He was a man who had earned his seat at the table, and he would fight for it until the very end. The silence in the room broke when the older executive spoke again, his voice more measured this time. "Maybe you're right," he said, his tone softer than before. "Maybe it is time for something different. But change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. And we're going to need to be careful, to make sure that we're moving forward in the right way." The CEO nodded, understanding. "I'm not asking for everything to change all at once. What I'm asking for is a commitment to change, to start moving in the right direction. And I'm willing to lead the way. But it's going to take all of us, not just me, to make it happen." The older executive nodded slowly, the first genuine gesture of agreement. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as if the weight of the decision had shifted. The CEO knew it wasn't over yet, but he also knew that this was a pivotal moment, a moment where things could begin to change, slowly but surely. He wasn't going to back down, and neither were they. The fight wasn't over, but the first steps had been taken. The meeting had stretched on for hours, but the air in the room had shifted dramatically. The conversations had moved away from doubt and resistance, and now, for the first time, they were focused on the future, on the path forward, on what the company could become if they were willing to change. The CEO could feel the change in the room, the subtle but undeniable shift. They weren't just listening to him anymore, they were beginning to see what he had been trying to show them all along. His success wasn't a fluke. It wasn't some anomaly in the system that they could dismiss. It was proof that things could be done differently, that it was possible to break through the barriers that had always existed and build something new, something better. The younger executive, the one who had been the most skeptical, spoke up again. His voice was more thoughtful this time, less filled with doubt and more with curiosity. "So, what's next?" he asked. "How do we start making these changes? It's easy to say that we need to do better, but how do we actually make it happen?" The CEO took a moment before responding, his mind racing through the possibilities. He had spent so many years preparing for this very moment where the door to real change was finally opening. It wasn't enough to just talk about it. He had to act. First, he said, his voice steady, we start by making diversity and inclusion a part of everything we do, not just a buzzword or a box to check off. We need to ensure that people from all backgrounds have the opportunity to rise through the ranks, not just the ones who look like the majority in this room. That means creating a culture that actively supports growth, mentorship, and opportunity for everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background. The room was silent for a moment as the executives processed the words. The CEO could feel their resistance beginning to melt away, just a little. They had all seen the statistics, they had all heard the rhetoric, but they had never really understood what it meant. Until now. They had never realized how deeply the system had been skewed in favor of those already at the top. And how do we make sure this isn't just lip service? One of the older executives asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. How do we hold ourselves accountable? We've all heard these ideas before, but they don't always come to fruition. The CEO nodded. Accountability is key, he said firmly. It's not enough to just say we're going to do better. We need measurable goals, concrete actions, and transparency in everything we do. We need to put real systems in place to ensure that everyone is treated fairly and given the chance to succeed based on their abilities, not on their background. That means looking at our hiring practices, our promotion systems, and how we evaluate talent. We need to make sure that we're not just perpetuating the same old patterns. He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was quiet, but the executives were listening now, really listening. He could see the gears turning in their minds, each of them contemplating the long road ahead, the hard work it would take to turn these ideas into reality. The older executive who had spoken before leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he thought it over. You're asking us to radically change how we operate, he said slowly, almost as if testing the idea out loud. That's not going to be easy. But I can see what you're saying. If we don't make these changes, we're not going to survive in the long term. The world is changing, and if we don't change with it, we'll be left behind. The CEO nodded, feeling a small sense of victory. This was it. This was the turning point. They were beginning to understand that change wasn't just a moral imperative, it was a business imperative. Exactly, the CEO replied. It's not just about doing the right thing, it's about ensuring that we can continue to succeed, that we can thrive in a world that is more diverse, more inclusive, and more dynamic than ever before. This is our opportunity to lead, not just in terms of profit, but in terms of how we shape the future. The room was still for a moment, but it was a different kind of stillness now. It wasn't the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of recognition. The CEO had spoken the truth, and for the first time, they were ready to listen, ready to act. This was only the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, and there would be plenty of obstacles to overcome, but the CEO knew that they were on the right path. He had given them the vision, and now, it was time for them to decide whether they were willing to walk it with him. As the meeting progressed, a sense of determination began to take hold in the room. The walls that had once seemed so impenetrable were now starting to feel more porous, and for the first time, the executives weren't just hearing the CEO, they were beginning to believe in what he was saying. The CEO knew that this moment, this shift in the room, was a critical one. But he also understood that the true test would come in the weeks and months ahead, when the words spoken today would be put to the test by real actions, real decisions, and real change. There was no more room for hesitation. The time for talk was over, it was time for the company to walk the walk. He could feel the eyes of the room on him as the conversation turned toward practical steps. The younger executive, who had been so skeptical at the start, spoke again, but this time there was a new respect in his voice. We need to set clear goals, he said, his voice steady. We need to measure our progress, hold ourselves accountable, and be transparent every step of the way. We can't just make promises, we have to deliver. The CEO nodded, knowing that this was exactly the kind of thinking they needed. Accountability is the cornerstone of change, he said, his voice strong. We will set clear, measurable goals. We will track our progress, and we will report on it honestly. And if we fail? We learn from it. We adapt. But we don't quit. We don't let the system break us. We break it. There was a pause, and the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. The weight of his words hung in the air, a challenge to all of them. For the first time, they were faced with the reality that change would not be easy. It would require sacrifice, hard decisions, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about their own biases, their own systems. The older executive who had been most resistant to the idea of change finally spoke up again, his voice quieter now, but still firm. "I think we can all agree that we need a long-term commitment to this," he said, his tone more thoughtful than before. "But it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. We're going to face resistance from people inside and outside the company. But if we're serious about this, we have to be willing to push through that resistance, no matter how hard it gets." The CEO looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each of the executives. He could see that they were beginning to understand not just that change was necessary, but that they were the ones who had the power to make it happen. "I'm not asking for perfection," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I'm asking for commitment. I'm asking for the willingness to do the hard work, to step outside of our comfort zones, and to build a company that reflects the world we want to see, not the world that's been handed to us. We are at a crossroads, and what we do next will define the future of this company. It's on us to decide what kind of legacy we want to leave." The room was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of doubt or resistance, it was the silence of realization. They understood now. The challenges ahead were daunting, but they were also an opportunity to create something new, something better. The CEO had laid out a vision, and they could either embrace it or reject it. There was no middle ground. One of the younger executives, the same one who had questioned him earlier, spoke up once more, his voice filled with determination. "I'm in," he said simply. "I think we can make this work. It's going to be tough, but it's the right thing to do. I'm ready to push for it." The CEO nodded, his eyes meeting those of the other executives in the room. One by one, they began to speak, their voices joining in a chorus of reluctant yet resolute agreement. "I'm in too," another executive said. "Let's do it." "We're with you," a third added. For the first time, the CEO felt a sense of real unity in the room. They weren't just saying the words, they were beginning to believe them. And in that moment, he knew that this was not just a business deal. This was the beginning of something much bigger. It was the beginning of a movement, one that could ripple through the company, through the industry, and beyond. It would be a long road, but for the first time, he felt like they were ready to walk it together. As the meeting wrapped up, there was a palpable shift in the energy of the room. What had started as a tense, guarded conversation had evolved into something much more profound, a shared commitment to something bigger than all of them. The CEO could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The executives were no longer just agreeing for the sake of agreeing, they were truly on board. He could see it in their eyes, hear it in their voices. This wasn't just about changing a few policies or ticking boxes, it was about building a new foundation, one that was more inclusive, more forward-thinking, and more reflective of the world they were all living in. The CEO knew that the real work was still ahead of them. This was just the beginning, and there was no denying the challenges they would face. They were embarking on a journey that would push them all to their limits, to confront biases and deeply ingrained systems that had been in place for generations. But for the first time, the CEO felt a genuine sense of hope. The company, the people in this room, were ready to take on the challenge. The road would not be easy, but it would be worth it. As the CEO gathered his things and prepared to leave the room, he exchanged glances with the executives. There was a silent understanding now, a shared acknowledgement of the difficult path that lay ahead. But there was also a new sense of unity, a recognition that they were in this together. They were no longer just individual players in a corporate game, they were part of something bigger. "Let's get to work," one of the younger executives said, breaking the silence. The words were simple, but they carried a weight of resolve that the CEO hadn't expected. It was as though the shift in the room had become tangible. And they were all ready to dive in and start making the changes that had been talked about for so long. The CEO nodded, a small but genuine smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "We're just getting started," he said. The executives rose from their chairs, shaking hands and offering their support. There was a sense of camaraderie now, a bond that had not been there before. The battle was far from over, but the first steps had been taken, and for the first time in a long while, the CEO felt as though he wasn't walking alone. Outside the conference room, the world still felt heavy, still filled with the weight of the systemic barriers that had been built over centuries. But inside that room, something had shifted. They had taken the first step toward breaking those barriers down, toward creating a company that was truly reflective of the world around them. The CEO knew that the fight for equality and inclusion wasn't something that could be won in one day, one meeting, or even one year. But today, for the first time, it felt possible. And as he stepped out into the hallway, the future seemed a little brighter, the road ahead a little clearer. He knew the challenges would come, but he was ready for them. He had the strength, the vision, and now, the support of those around him. Together, they would face whatever came next, and together, they would build a company that was not just successful, but truly transformative. Weeks passed, and the changes that had been discussed in the meeting slowly started to take root. The CEO had kept his promise, he wasn't going to let the momentum die. He had set up task forces, gathered data, and began working closely with HR, diversity consultants, and executives to ensure that the systems they had put in place would actually work. The road was long and full of obstacles, but each step forward felt like a victory. Slowly, the company started to change, new recruitment policies were established, mentorship programs for underrepresented groups were launched, and diversity goals were set and tracked. There were setbacks, of course. There were moments when it felt like the change was too slow, when people within the company resisted, and when old ways of thinking crept back in. But through it all, the CEO remained committed, holding firm to the vision that had sparked this entire movement. The company's leadership was evolving, and it wasn't just the executives who were noticing. The employees, the ones who had quietly fought against the walls of exclusion for years, were beginning to see real change. The diversity they had longed for was becoming visible not just in the numbers, but in the way people were being treated, in the opportunities that were being offered, and in the conversations that were happening. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was progress. One day, as the CEO walked through the office, he passed by a group of employees who had been with the company for years. They were talking, laughing, and for the first time, he noticed that their conversation wasn't just about the work at hand, it was about how they were finally being seen, how their voices mattered. He overheard one of them say, "It's different now. It really feels like they're listening." The CEO stopped for a moment, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. It was working. They were making a difference. But there was still so much to do. The work would never be done, he knew that. The world was still filled with barriers, with people who didn't believe in equality, who didn't believe in inclusion. But for the first time, the CEO had hope not just for his company, but for the broader world. Maybe, just maybe, the ripple effect they had started would reach further than anyone had anticipated. One evening, as the CEO sat in his office, looking out over the city lights, he thought about everything that had led him to this point. He thought about the days when he had been dismissed, when he had been doubted, when his worth had been questioned because of the color of his skin. He thought about how hard he had fought to prove that he was just as capable, just as worthy as anyone else in that room. And then he thought about the people around him, the executives, the employees, the people who had once doubted him but were now following his lead, pushing forward with him. They were all in this together now. The change wasn't just his, it was theirs too. And that was what mattered. The legacy of his leadership wouldn't be measured in dollars or deals closed. It would be measured in the lasting change they had made, in the doors they had opened, and in the voices they had elevated. This wasn't just about being the first black CEO to achieve success, it was about changing the very structure of the corporate world, about proving that excellence had no color, no boundaries. As he sat back in his chair, a quiet sense of fulfillment washed over him. There was still much to do, but the foundation was laid, and the future was brighter than it had ever been. He knew the road ahead would have its challenges, but with the team behind him, with the support of those who believed in what they were building, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The journey was just beginning, but for the first time, he believed that anything was possible.